Hello again. Now, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana is ringing in the changes when it comes to BEE regulations at state-owned enterprises. He's gazetted new preferential procurement rules. This means state-owned entities no longer have to disqualify suppliers for not meeting BEE requirements. Let's get reaction to this from Piet le Roux, the Chief Executive of Sakeliga. Piet, good afternoon. Welcome to Today on ENCA. Thank you very much for your time, sir. So what's your reaction to this news that SOEs no longer have to comply with procurement, preferential procurement, BEE requirements?
Well, I think it's very welcome. It's the result of a 5-year litigation effort by Sakeliga and the members who made that possible, because we knew that the regulations issued in 2017 by Minister Godongwana were ultra vires, and we considered them harmful, very harmful indeed, to the public in South Africa, because they interjected into every transaction in state procurement an intermediary that wasn't necessary for the best value for the public. And that sometimes that could happily coincide, but often and usually that meant huge excesses in cost, and whether it's for local content or for BE. So we welcome it. I just should point out that there are still preferential procurement regulations. It's just that for the first time in many, many years in South Africa now, these regulations make no mention of BE nor of local content requirements. And I think that's very good from a public point of view.
And they also allow or empower state organs to determine their own preferential procurement policies within the framework that still exists around the preferential procurement.
Yes, indeed. And that is as it should be, constitutionally speaking. The Framework Act, it's already in the name of the Act. The Act is supposed, in terms of the Constitution, to provide a framework for preferential policy and not to prescribe the kinds of what that policy should look like in detail, as the Minister of Finance before the current one tried to do.
Yeah, what do you say to critics who believe that this kind of change will disadvantage small and medium-owned, black-owned organizations that want to compete when bigger established companies will be able to get a foot in the door?
I think the purpose, we must recall, of state procurement, as Justice Raymond Zondo recently did in the Zondo Commission, the purpose of state procurement is value for money for the public. That is the overriding obligation. It's also, constitutionally speaking, in Section 2171 of the Constitution, the yardstick against which all procurement should be measured. And it is always possible in any transaction, in any economy in the world, to cut off a little bit and give it to some people, but that will come at the expense of the great majority of people who were supposed to benefit from that procurement. So my advice to companies who want to compete is to compete and make sure that they are as good as they can be. And that, of course, will sometimes be black companies, or it will be local companies, or it will be companies with shareholders from all kinds of races. I say that it's very important not to make the companies the beneficiaries, but to remember that public procurement is for the benefit of the public. And we're seeing crises all across this country, and many local municipalities who are in dire straits financially. There's no room for these kinds of extras.
Yeah, you referred to the year 2017 in terms of what the former minister had done, or the minister at the time had done, Pravin Gordhan, and then this all ended up in court, and the Concord ruling, of course, that the regulations, the 2017 regulations, were inconsistent with the existing preferential procurement policy framework. So currently, this decision by Enoch Godongwana is to address that. So what do you look forward to? What do you look forward to as Sakeliga next, now that this has been decided?
I think we're ushering in a new era of state procurement, and it will be, there is now a restored discretion for state entities, and these range from municipalities to provinces to state-owned entities. All of them now have the opportunity to apply a preferential procurement policy that is applicable to their circumstances. And also they're able to say that their policy includes not paying extra premiums for considerations of race or local content, but to focus on value for money for the consumer. And that discretion is something that has been forgotten. And it was at the back, left by the wayside for many years in South Africa. So I think that is the defining characteristic of state procurement going forward for the foreseeable future, is much greater discretion on state entities that are able to do value for money procurement for their communities instead of for a few entities who want to skim off for whatever purposes on the way there. And let me just say one more thing, that is it is important to understand that it is an obligation of municipalities, an obligation of them to do value for money procurement. And where they can match that with preferential procurement, they're allowed to do preferential procurement, but they cannot do preferential procurement at the cost of the overriding consideration, which should be the benefit of the public. And I think that is also what we saw pointed out in the Zondo report.
Yeah, I mean, these updated procurement measures for SOEs have been a very hot topic for quite some time. Now, looking ahead, coming to next year, I understand the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana, has said the government is going to introduce the new public procurement bill to Parliament in March next year. I don't know if you are aware of that, and if you are, and you as Sakeliga, what do you hope will be considered in the drafting of that bill, and will you participate in the public process?
Yeah, we are already participating in the process, and I think we are perhaps the main entity that's shaping all these changes, given the litigation that we undertook. And we didn't start with litigation, of course. We started by sending Minister Pravin Gordhan back then letters and so on, but it ended up in litigation. And if it's necessary, we will go there again. I think that what we'd like to see, at least in order to avoid litigation in future, is a preferential procurement bill or a procurement bill that allows for procurement that is based on the overriding consideration, which should be value for the public, value for the communities that the state entities should serve. If that is the overriding interest, then we will be happy with it. If it is not, then of course we will have to intervene again. Fortunately, the Constitution is strong in this regard, and we have great hope for litigation. But in the end, we must also remember that BE, while it was maybe 10 years ago difficult to criticize it, today it's obviously a failure, and criticism comes from it from all angles. It comes from Sakeliga, sure, but it also comes from black people, it comes from black business people, it comes from commentators, it comes from international quarters, from internationally renowned economists, it comes from international businesses, it comes from embassies, it comes from trade attaches. All around us, we are seeing the momentum turning against BE. Why? Not because people wish not to undo unfair discrimination or to help people, but because we realize that BE has harmed the intent of creating a more favorable and flourishing economy, including for black people. It's ironic, but BE is very, very harmful. And so that's why we will oppose it.
I'm sure there'll be many people who might not agree with that statement, but as you say, there are also voices that are pointing to the failures of BE in how they've affected economic growth in South Africa. There should be something else going forward, maybe that will have to replace BE without disempowering people. What are your thoughts on that, very briefly?
I think the key will be to start with serving the public and make everything subject to that consideration. And whatever is possible within that framework, people are free to experiment with. And I think it's important to allow for experimentation instead of a very centrally directed policy that every state entity should follow. And these new procurement regulations and the litigation that led to them has opened that way for a great diversity of experiments to happen at local level and at state entities. And we must also recall that, as we will show in more statements later this week, more than 700 state entities have requested exemptions just since February of this year from the regulations. Even people like Minister Godongwana has requested exemptions. And so it is clear that even from within government, from within all state entities, there is a need to move away from these strict considerations, preferential BE and local content requirements, and within that experimental world in which the overriding interest is public interest. In that, I think there lies the answer.
Yeah, the intention was to redress the past, redress the imbalances of the past. which were created under the apartheid government. But do you think where things have failed now, if so many public entities are requesting exemption from the existing preferential procurement, as an example, do you think it's been how it was implemented, or was it in the percentages that were set up?
Well, I think I could quote I think it was Mletsi Mbeki who recently said that people sometimes think it's how BE was implemented that was the problem, but it was actually the concept. And I agree with that. BE as a concept, as an idea that from a central point in the country you can direct and introduce, tell all state entities how they should procure on secondary considerations rather than primary ones, which should be the public interest. Whenever you do that, I think you will not lead. There will be no redress because you will in effect harm the people you were supposedly helping. I know it sounds counterintuitive. It sounds even paradoxical. But the best thing that can happen to redress in this country, that can happen for flourishing and for to have fewer people unemployed and to have fewer people poor, would be to end BE and local content requirements. It would be a great improvement.
I wish we had more time to unpack that on that note, but we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Piet. That's Piet le Roux. He's the CEO of Sakeliga. They are welcoming the government's decision to free, so to speak, the state-owned enterprises from those strict preferential procurement regulations under BE, that they no longer have to consider everything there in order for them to award contracts. It has to be done differently now. And